Hello and welcome back to another episode of Generation Ochi. My name is American Ben, and today we're going to break down the ending of Sweet Home in depth. For those who need a refresher, Sweet Home, based on the webtoon of the same name, tells the story of the residents of the Green Home apartment complex. Kindly people who have suddenly been thrust into a post-apocalyptic world overrunning killer monsters. And they remain trapped at Green Home, as well as in their own minds, as they struggle to survive demons within and without. Of course, some of the residents themselves turn into monsters as their desires consume them and eventually have transformative effects on their physical appearances. We've talked a lot about the underlying messages and themes inherent to Sweet Home, and if you haven't watched those videos, I do hope you give them a chance after you finish this one, because Sweet Home's narrative is rather substantive, and it deserves deeper exploration than what you're able to infer after a single viewing. However, today I imagine you come to me for a more practical answer. What the heck happened at the end there? No problem, I can be of some help in this regard. In the season finale, the army surrounded the Green Home apartments in search of special infectees inside. Humans cursed with monsterization, but who are able to resist full transformation and persist in constant oscillation between forms. Cha Hyun-soo and the final baddie Umi-young are the special infectees we saw in the show. As the army watched from a distance, one of the surviving gang members who showed up to terrorize the Green Home residents in episode 9 pulled a lever in the tunnels below the building, which caused a huge explosion and thus commenced Green Home's implosion. The army then opened fire on the building in response, and the characters barricaded inside had to sneak out of harm's way through the secret tunnels we just mentioned. On the way out, Eun-yuk told his sister Eun-yu that he would go back up and get Yoon-soo, who had been left behind, but instead, when he returned to the building, he remained there. As the rubble came down on him, his nose started to bleed, demonstrating that he was probably infected at that point, and thus wanted to die before he turned into a monster. Or, I don't know, the place was getting kind of dry and dusty, so it could have just been a regular nosebleed. If he was infected, though, it's possible that this was Golden Hour, a brief period of time, about 60 minutes long or so, during which humans in the process of monsterization are vulnerable to attacks because they are not able to regenerate. That said, we don't know for sure if Yoon-yuk actually died. He might have been able to heal from the damage he incurred from the crushing weight of the rubble, albeit maybe a little bit flattened. For almost the entirety of the show, he seemed like a rather detached, unempathetic person who saw survival as a practical end. However, the truth is that he took on a leadership role and dedicated himself to ensuring the group's safety. In the end, he sacrificed himself so that the group wouldn't have to deal with his monster form. Appearances can belie one's true character, but more on that in a bit. As for the rest of the residents, they escaped through the tunnels and came out on the other side only to find the army waiting for them there. The commanding officer told former firefighter and special forces officer So Hee-kyung that as she wasn't the one who activated the tracking beacon which led the army to Green Home, she thus hadn't lived up to her end of the bargain, and implied that the army may thus not live up to theirs and provide her with information on her missing fiancé. However, despite saying that their deal is cancelled, it seemed like the commanding officer was possibly willing to give Hee-kyung a second chance to come through for them. I say this because as the residents of Green Home were taken away in a truck, Hee-kyung walked up to them decked out in a sick military getup, all like, yeah, I'm cool, and told them to survive. I assume she committed to work with the army not necessarily because she digged their whole vibe or general modus operandi, but because she wanted to uncover the mysteries behind the disappearance of her fiancé. It's possible her former beau is himself a special infectee, or was victim to some sort of government experiment gone wrong, and though we can't be sure, perhaps the mysterious briefcase Hee-kyung delivered to the army holds some of such answers. Then there's Cha Yoon-soo's ending. We last saw him riding along in an armored vehicle in the custody of the military. He was stirred to consciousness by a familiar voice, that of Sang-wook, or so it seemed. Sang-wook's face was mysteriously free from its characteristic scars. So it's possible he is now currently a special infectee with regenerative capabilities. Though I've seen some people suggest that Umi-young is now inhabiting his body. We'll have to wait until next season to fully understand what's going on with these 2 or 3 characters. Oh, and I should probably say something about Eun-gil-sub, the terminally ill old man who spent his final moments digging up a plot of soil in an attempt to locate the entrance to a secret tunnel out of Green Home, which he nearly accomplished, though Hee-kyung finished his work after he finally succumbed to his illness. During the course of his dig, some peculiar things happened. For example, while talking to Yuri, his caretaker, she had an asthma attack, collapsed, and was whisked away by Sang-wook. But then we saw Gil-sub later in the episode repeat the same lines he said to Yuri earlier as if they were still in conversation.
그것도 괜찮네. 흙만 더 부으면 되겠구만.
He apparently didn't notice that she had collapsed and actually was now presumably dead. And of course, he also seemed to witness an eclipse at one point. Now, there may have been some sort of weird time event here involving some sort of multidimensional dynamic. However, I think for now we have to attribute Gilsub's obliviousness to Yuri's absence to his ill state. After all, he died shortly after. And as for the eclipse, the most we can say about it is that eclipses oft signify the onset of supernatural events. And shortly after the one that occurred in Sweet Home, Yunsu fully monsterized, shooting a wing-like appendage of spikes out of his wrist in order to defeat Umiyong. Okay, so now we've pretty much summed up everything we can about the ending of Sweet Home. That said, you could have gotten most of this information elsewhere. To me, we have to look a bit deeper in order to truly understand the meaning of its ending, and that starts with Yunsu's exit from the Sweet Home premises. We've talked about this event a bit in other videos, but here I want to expound upon it. This scene is important for a few reasons. First, Yunsu, who began the show as a character struggling with his existence, now appeared to be rather composed and valiantly confronted the army head-on. However, beyond Yunsu's internal metamorphosis, the meaning of this scene is better understood by thinking about how we perceived it the first time we saw it. After all, his bold march beyond the walls of Sweet Home was the very first scene in this series as well. Only the first time we witnessed it, we perhaps didn't find it to be so bold. Well, aside from those of you who read the webtoon prior to watching the show. See, in addition to all of the other themes and messages the show conveys that we've discussed in other videos on this channel, Sweet Home also attempts to drive home a moral about how humans formulate judgments of others based on appearance. Many viewers of the show have criticized it for not including as many quote-unquote monsters in the second half of the show. But as we explained over the course of an entire video we did, the second half of the show did have monsters. It's just that for the most part, the humans served as the monsters during episodes 6 through 10 or so. Just because a creature is giant and grotesque doesn't mean that it's a monster. Monstrosity is born from within. The show makes this obvious. Human cravings lead people to physically monsterize. However, what's the difference between the gangsters that show up during episode 9 and, say, the blind monster? Actually, it's possible the so-called monsters in Green Home account for less kills than humans do overall. Humans kill more humans. So who are the monsters? But we know this, so back to Hyunsu. The first time we saw him walk out of Green Home, we thought, what the hell is that dark-eyed demon? Kill it, burn it with fire. We were scared of it because we don't know it. But the second time we saw the scene, we knew Hyunsu. He was now the hero in our eyes, and we were much more suspicious about the military's intentions. Our entire perspective had changed because we got to know Hyunsu and were thus able to humanize him. And this shift doesn't just go for Hyunsu. Our perspective of almost all the characters shifts from episode 1 to 10. When Jisoo first met Myung-suk, the grieving and delusional mother in episode 1, she was creeped out by her. We were creeped out by her because she did some weird things. But when we came to understand why she did such things, we sympathized with her and came to see her as a good person. Devout Christian Jaehoon also kind of creeped Jisoo and we the audience out at first, but he turned out to be a noble and selfless person in the end and bonded with Jisoo before giving his life for the sake of the other tenants. At first, former ballerina Yoon-yu seemed like a fairly mean-spirited person. However, by the end of the show, she revealed herself to be caring as she consoled Jisoo in her own way when Jisoo was in despair. When we first met Sang-wook, we thought he was a violent gangster. After all, he had a man tied up in his apartment and was torturing him. However, by the end of the show, we learned that Sang-wook was a fairly caring person as well. He only abused Yoon-jae because Yoon-jae had abused children. And Sang-wook also went out of his way to protect Yuri. At one point early on in the show, Yoon-yu even openly remarked on how appearance can belie one's true nature.
백순간 생긴 건 꼭 깡패 같기도 하고.
Yuri actually worked the opposite way in this regard. She was rather quiet and unassuming, but eventually revealed herself to be one of the most courageous and principled characters at Green Home. And so you may say, okay, the lesson here is what? Don't judge a book by its cover? Well, yeah, simple lesson, but conveyed in a complex way. We don't realize that the lesson is true for all of the characters in Sweet Home. We think it's just true for, say, the slime monster, who turns out to be a friendly creature, and who, by the way, was killed by characters who we perhaps thought were incapable of monstrous action because of their appearances and overt personalities. Our ingrained prejudices are hard to overcome, even when we know the show wants us to lay them aside. It's easy to look at the protein monster or the starving monster and say, yeah, that's an evil creature. But when the friendly Green Home residents burn the slime monster to death, or engage in abusive behavior towards one of the gangsters, do we then call them monsters, or do they get a pass because they look a certain way? Sometimes we don't see monsters when we should, and sometimes we see monsters when we maybe shouldn't. This goes for how we see ourselves. Hyun-soo saw himself as a monster. He struggled with his self-image because he felt guilty about the violent urges he had towards people. We all have these thoughts about ourselves sometimes. Am I a monster? And sometimes they actually help to keep us in check. But monster is a hard term to define. Perhaps we're all a little bit monstrous inside. What's more important though is that people's natures are not always so readily discerned. The residents of Green Home are all victims of life's hardships. They've all experienced pain and brutality, and thus sometimes their hurt manifests in ways that make them appear to be bad or unkind to others. And this begets greater problems for the world as people then react unkindly in response. In general, it takes time to uncover the true essence of people. To a viewer tuning into Sweet Home for the first time, at the point that An Sun-young is holding a knife behind her back, preparing to stab her husband, she might have seemed like an evil psycho. And yet, little would that person know, An Sun-young was at her limit, on edge after years of abuse. And having gone so long without an ally to support her, she was lost in despair and could no longer restrain her fury. And that's not to justify stabbing people who make you angry, but more to say that people are more than their appearances present, and certainly more than their first impressions often imply. Sweet Home forces us to confront the faulty notions of Hyun-soo we conceived during the show's first scene by repeating that same scene again in the final episode. Anyways, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I did a good job explaining Sweet Home's ending. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a big thumbs up. Comment down below. Let me know what you think of this video and Sweet Home's ending. Remember to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a damn thing. For now, my name is American Ben, Generation Ochi. Peace.